The Silent Guardian. James Carter was not a man of many words. A mechanic by trade, he spent his days fixing cars in his small town garage, his hands constantly stained with grease and oil. He was a simple man, never one to indulge in grand speeches or outward displays of affection. But his love for his son, Ethan, was deep, unwavering, and expressed in ways only a few could understand. Ethan had always been an observant child. Even as a boy, he noticed how his father never missed a day of work, no matter how tired he seemed. He noticed how James would always leave the last piece of food for him at the dinner table. He noticed how his father stood at the doorway whenever he left for school, watching silently until he turned the corner. But it wasn't until Ethan grew older that he truly began to understand what it meant to have a good father. Sacrifices unseen. Ethan's mother had passed away when he was just 5. James never spoke much about it, and whenever Ethan asked, his father would simply smile and say, "She was the best woman I ever knew." But the absence of a mother was something Ethan always felt, especially during school events where other kids had both parents cheering them on. James never missed a single one of those events. No matter how busy he was at the garage, he always found a way to be there, standing at the back of the crowd in his worn-out work overalls. He never clapped the loudest, never shouted Ethan's name, but Ethan always knew his father was there. There were days when money was tight, but James never let Ethan feel the weight of their struggles. When Ethan was 12, he wanted a bicycle more than anything in the world. He watched as his friends rode around the neighborhood, laughing, their wheels spinning freely under the sun. James noticed. One evening, after closing the garage, James came home with a second-hand bike. It wasn't brand new, but he had cleaned and repaired every inch of it, making it look as good as new. When he handed it to Ethan, all he said was, "Take care of it." Ethan rode that bike every day. He didn't realize until years later that James had worked extra hours to afford it. Lessons without words. James taught Ethan lessons not through lectures, but through actions. When their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, struggled with her groceries, James carried her bags without being asked. When a stranded driver's car broke down near the garage, James fixed it first and only then asked if they could pay. One night, when Ethan was 16, he came home frustrated. He had gotten into an argument with a classmate who had insulted him. "I should have hit him," Ethan muttered angrily. James, who was fixing a radio at the kitchen table, looked up. And what would that have solved? "He would have learned not to mess with me," Ethan shot back. James put down his screwdriver and leaned forward. "Respect isn't something you take, son, it's something you earn." Ethan wanted to argue, but something in his father's calm, unwavering gaze made him think twice. The hardest goodbye. When Ethan turned 18, he received an acceptance letter from a university in another state. It was a dream come true, but part of him hesitated. He knew that if he left, his father would be alone. The garage was their home, their livelihood, but it was also James's entire world. On the night before Ethan was set to leave, he found his father sitting outside on the porch, staring at the night sky. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan said, sitting beside him. James nodded. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "When you were born, your mother told me that our job as parents isn't to hold on, but to prepare you to fly." He turned to Ethan and gave a small smile. "It's time for you to fly." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "I'll visit as much as I can." James nodded again, but didn't say anything else. The next morning, as Ethan packed the last of his bags into his car, he saw his father standing by the garage. He didn't say much, just patted Ethan's shoulder and said, "Be good. Work hard." As Ethan drove away, he saw his father in the rearview mirror, standing at the same spot, watching him leave, just as he had every morning before school. A father's love never fades. College was challenging, but Ethan carried his father's lessons with him. He worked hard, stayed humble, and treated people with kindness. He called his father every Sunday, and though James never spoke for long, Ethan could always hear the pride in his voice. Years passed, and Ethan graduated, found a job, and built a life of his own. But he never forgot where he came from. One day, he received a call from a neighbor back home. James had fallen ill. Without a second thought, Ethan packed his bags and drove back to the small town he had left behind. When he arrived, he found his father in the garage, stubborn as ever, trying to fix an old car. "You should be resting," Ethan said, taking the wrench from his hands. James chuckled. "I rest when there's nothing left to fix." Ethan shook his head and helped his father to a chair. As he looked around the garage, he realized how much of his childhood was wrapped up in this place. The smell of oil, the sound of tools clanking, the silent presence of a father who had given him everything without ever asking for anything in return. That night, as James sat on the porch once again, Ethan joined him. But this time, it was Ethan who broke the silence. "You know, Dad, I've spent my whole life watching you, and I don't think I ever said it, but thank you." James didn't reply right away. He simply placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder, the same way he always had. And in that moment, Ethan knew he had always been loved, always been cared for. Even in silence, his father had spoken volumes. Because sometimes the best fathers are the ones who don't need to say much. They just show up, day after day, loving in the quietest, most powerful ways.